Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Morris, and today we'll be looking at the ABPM Seebeck, Chapter 8, which is the process organization. This chapter was written by Tony Benedict, and as I said, today I will be the presenter. Now, a little bit of background on Tony. He's the Vice President of Procurement and Supply Chain Certifications for Scottsdale Lincoln Health Network. Before that, he was the CIO and Vice President of Supply Chain for Tenet at Abruzzo Healthcare. He's also been the Senior Manager for Supply Chain at Tata Consultancy. He is the president of the ABPMP International, president of the board, and he has a bachelor's degree in psychobiology, and actually don't ask me what that is because I have no clue, but from Albright College, and a master's, an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh, Katz Graduate School. And as I mentioned, he is the author of this chapter, as well as other papers and articles. A little bit of background on myself. I'm the managing principal with Wendon Consulting. I'm a certified business process professional, as well as a certified business architect. I've led the business transformation practices at Tata Consultancy, at Capco, and at Infosys. Before that, I was an executive consultant with IBM. I've written 4 books, a lot of different papers, articles, and I'm a columnist for PEX, which is the Process Excellence Group. Each of the chapters in the Seebeck has a noted person who has written the introduction to that chapter. This chapter, it was Andrew Spaney, who is the president of Spaney International. Before that, he was a senior vice president at Skona and a managing partner with Rumler Braish. He has written several books and over 50 papers and articles. He's an international speaker. He's a member of the board of directors for the ABPMP Association with over 30 years of experience and over 130 major projects under his belt. So, very experienced individual. Now, for those who've attended the other sessions on the Seebeck, this will be kind of redundant, but for those who are new, I'd like to make sure that you're acquainted with the efforts that were made to make sure that the Seebeck is a very high-quality document, and from the standpoint it presents the latest concepts, ideas, findings, techniques, but from a perspective of their actual use. So the Seebeck really has a little theory, but it's mainly a practitioner's guide. The information in it has all been vetted by practitioners, people in the field who actually use this information to perform projects. The chapters, in the left-hand side of this slide, you can see the chapter names, numbers, and the authors of those chapters. On the rest of it, we've had several review committees. What we wanted to make sure is that no chapter was essentially the opinion of a single individual, even though they're very knowledgeable and high-quality individuals. What we wanted to do is to make sure that the Seebeck became a collaborative effort, and that through that collaboration, we addressed as many of the individual topics related to the different areas as we could, and that we addressed them in a way that would provide the type of guidance that people could rely on. The Seebeck itself is not a regular business book. It's not meant to be read cover to cover in a continuous flow from the front to the back with like a business case. It's meant as a reference guide. Each chapter stands alone and is built so that the people on a given team or a given company can look at a specific piece of a specific topic and get the information they need, the background they need for that area. So you'll find that there's some overlap in there because each of the topics become self-contained. And one of the things that you'll see on the far right-hand side, the full Seebeck Review Committee dealt with was making sure that everything was aligned. And so that the concepts that were presented from different perspectives and multiple areas all aligned, and there were no conflicts or that type of thing involved. Now, Chapter 8, the process organization, essentially looks at how things are evolving from a traditional organization to a new type of organization around process. The sections that are in the chapter and that we'll be covering today deal with the process-driven organization, moving from a hierarchical structure to a process-driven organization, the roles that we have in process management, governance, and then we'll go through a summary and talk about some key concepts. Now, go down here. Okay. One of the things that we need to start with at this point is a look at what people mean by process. And we've talked about this in a couple of the other Seebeck webinar sessions, but it certainly bears a review. And from a process perspective, what ABPMP is looking at is process is cross-organization, cross-function. It has a definite start and a definite end. It produces something. And as such, it's a pretty broad view of what a process really is. It starts, as an example, it can start even before an order with some type of advertising, some type of marketing campaign goes through till the order is fulfilled and shipped. So, that it's kind of all-encompassing. Process then can break down into sub-processes, and sub-processes then start to be aligned to organizations. Now, at that level, what we're saying is the process is kind of conceptual, and one of the things that we know is that a lot of organizations have a difficult time trying to figure out what processes are and what that term really means. And the example that I like to give is I was in one organization and I was talking to essentially a data entry clerk. And I asked her what her job was, and we were talking about that. I said, well, what process are you part of? And what she said was, well, this is my process. I take this piece of paper, I key this in, and I put it on the side. And I said, well, normally we look at that as kind of a task, but no, she didn't. That's my process. So one of the things that we find is that in moving to a process-driven organization, you have at the fundamental level a need to start to define terms. And the definition of the terms can change within organizations or within companies, but to the extent that between company to company, but within a company, you should really try to make that as standard as you possibly can, so that as people talk to one another, they have a common understanding of what's going on. Now, in Chapter 1, or I should say the Chapter 8 goal is to help businesses understand and anticipate, plan, prepare, and guide the business through a transformation from a more traditional hierarchical structure to a more process-focused structure, which is a horizontal view of the business operation. Now, in doing that, one of the things, and this becomes difficult, is that we need to refocus the way a lot of executives think about the structure of their institution. And we need to, understand that companies historically have been structured around function, maybe geography, and maybe some product disciplines. But even today, few companies, I know of a few, but few companies are really structured around process. What we're starting to see is a type of hybrid being created, excuse me, where you have a matrix with the traditional hierarchical structure and then an overlay of a process. It becomes difficult to manage, but it's manageable. Now, one of the keys in looking at why one would want to do this is the fact that you have a very different way of looking at performance, at looking at cost, at looking at quality, looking at a lot of different things. In the traditional way, you are bound by the organization structure. And that creates kind of, we'll say, the box that you're dealing with. Well, a process having components in multiple different organizations, in the traditional way, you can never take a real look at what's going on with the process, why things are happening the way they're happening, how you can really be innovative, how you can really save costs, and how you can really improve the value proposition to the customer. So by taking a process view and rolling it up from that traditional hierarchical view of organization, rolling it up to process, again being cross-organization, you can have a very different look at how you're going to look at performance management. What are you going to measure? How are you going to measure it? How are you going to evaluate it? What are the standards? What are your targets going to be? Because I would submit to everyone that they're going to be very different at the process level than they are down in the organizations that make up that process. The other thing that it allows you to do is, from a strategic standpoint, the strategic goals of the organization are really related to what a process is doing, and instead of how that work is really being performed. So you can now take a different look at the way you're going to support the strategic goals of the organization, and then push those back down into the different organization units to look at their contribution to the process achieving its goals, which then align directly to how the organization is going to achieve its goals as a whole. Now, in looking at performance, one of the things that we talk about in Seebeck is the Rumbler Performance Matrix. And that really is a way of looking at and organizing the different levels that you're going to be dealing with, process, organization, individual, job, and then how you're going to start to organize your look at performance along there with goals, design, management, that type of thing. But what it does is it all helps you look at how do we move from the straight vertical look at the organization, the work in that organization, performance, cost, and all the things that we look at. How do we now roll that up and take, instead of a vertical view, also look at it from a horizontal perspective or a process perspective? Now, today, as we've mentioned, the real focus is on command and control of workers and their responsibilities to specific tasks. As you can see from the little chart on the graphic, it's really a vertical view of what's going on. Now, what this has done is, today we have kingdoms, we have silos. The problem that really has given us is that managers now have a vested interest in the status quo. I was in one organization and we were able to significantly reduce the staff size in that organization, and frankly the manager went absolutely nuts. And we really couldn't understand it until we looked at the compensation structure for the company. and found that, the manager had about 400 people reporting to him, and we cut it in half. The compensation structure was related strictly to how many people a given organization unit had reporting to it. Well, we now had a conflict between goals. The goal of the project was to reduce staff, but the goal of the manager was to have as many people as they could possibly have. So we had to then bring that conflict up to the C level and start to look at how that starts to change. And that's important only from the standpoint as you start to look at how you want to deal with the traditional vertical structure and the incentives and the different compensation programs that are aligned to it. How do you now then change that and kind of overlay it with a process structure? And how do you then get people to buy in without hurting themselves? So, there are those types of things that need to be considered as you start to look at how are we going to make this move? Are we going to just overlay it? How are we going to get people to buy into it? What are we going to do with it? So there's a lot of things that are a little bit hidden that you're going to need to be a little creative in looking at so that you can really start to understand how that operation works and what you really need to change in order to make it accept a new perspective. As I mentioned before, one of the things that we're starting to see more and more is kind of a matrix where you have a process manager that has responsibility for the overall process across multiple organization lines. The people in the organization lines have traditional reporting responsibilities and traditional authority. We've seen that work in a couple of different ways, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that can be, unless it's set up right, that can be a real tough road to follow because of governance and control. Now, okay. In looking at process, we've talked a little bit about what a process is, but there are some points here that I'd like to specifically call out as we talk about this. And the first is that in a process, if the process is going to be serial, and most of them, for the most part, are pretty serial, one of the things that you really need to check in setting this up is to make sure that all the work that's done in an upstream business unit will flow into the downstream, the next business unit in the process that's contributing to that process, that the output becomes additive and that you achieve value from each of those steps. Because if you don't, maybe you have something in that process that doesn't need to be there. Maybe you have something in that process erroneously. And when you were looking at putting that process definition together, you added something that might not need to be there. So when you're looking at defining that process, there are some things that you need to look at as far as the flow of work through that sits above the business unit. So does what's done in each business unit then contribute to the foundation that's needed for the next business unit to pick it up and carry it forward? And looking at that, you really need to start to look at defining that process in a way that people can really understand it. It can't, something that's too high level, nobody will understand. Something that's too low level, no one except your developers are going to care about. So it's, looking at it, but who does what? When did they do it? Why did they do it? How did they do it? Where did they do it? Pretty much, the standard business evaluation criteria fits into there. But when you start to do that, you now can align the work that's being done in the activities to the process and understand how everything fits together and how everything flows. And that is a fundamental foundation element in any consideration for moving from the traditional hierarchy. And frankly, today most companies really don't understand their processes. They know what work is being done, but they really don't know how it all fits together. Conceptually, but not really from an execution standpoint. The process manager at that point can be involved with all of the business managers, understanding what their contributions are, what they do, and start to look at working with them collaboratively, excuse me, to look at where the problems are, how things get done, and where the impediments are. Now, one of the kind of the neat things is once you're looking at this from a cross-functional process perspective, you can see things and you can deal with things very differently than you were able to before. Excuse me for 1 second here. Okay. My voice is starting to go. I apologize for that. You can start to deal with larger problems. You can start to deal with more strategic problems. And the things that you can start to look at from an innovation standpoint, from a improvement standpoint, and from overall, we'll say a strategic standpoint, and how as you look at changing the strategy of the company, are we going to get into a different market? Are we going to offer different product lines? What are we going to be doing? It allows you to tie that strategic view of the business operation more directly into what's being done by the company, and then look at it beyond the process, below the process, into what the business units are doing to make that up and how it's going to affect them. So it helps you have a very different understanding of the business operation and performance within that overall structure. Now, the impact of doing this becomes relatively significant. The first is forming these hybrid structures that I'm talking about. The difficulty in the hybrid structure is I've seen them the process view overlaid on top of the vertical, and what you find is oftentimes your process managers really don't have the authority to make anybody do anything. That becomes a problem. So at that point, governance becomes an issue, improvement becomes an issue, change becomes an issue. And I mention that simply because as this is being set up, a dual type of management activity has to be set up within that organization. Now, I've seen it where the process manager has a reporting responsibility to potentially one or more higher level managers within the organization. Those managers then each would have, as part of their management structure, those business units that make up the process. So because the process is cross-organization, you may have business units that report up to different people. And so the process manager becomes a matrix management organization or matrix management position. There are different ways of dealing with that. The key is not how you deal with it, but the fact that you remember that it must be dealt with, so that the process manager has the authority to make things happen. Now, the part of the thing that it also allows you to do is when you understand how everything fits together and you understand what the problems are, you understand what the system support is and all that type of thing, you can now create a series of high-performance teams. Within a department, you'll find that a department typically will support more than one process because departments are functionally oriented. So where you have multiple processes that have a same type of certain function being performed in them, we see that oftentimes they've been consolidated and within a given business unit. So what you'll have is a given business unit that supports multiple different processes, and it'll normally support them in a little bit different way, each one. So you can pretty much, oftentimes, without too much difficulty, start to look at how those functions break out and how they're performed for different, as part of different sub-processes. When you do that, you can start to then look at how you want to organize around that and what type of teams within those given business units you may want to have to deal with specialty type situations, your high performance teams. Another thing that it'll do is it recognizes that the silo organization is there. It recognizes the incentive that managers have to maintain that silo and not look outside it for budgeting purposes and other support. But it helps break those apart through that, whether you take a pure process view and a reorganization around just process, or the overlay of the type of horizontal that I'm talking about. You have an opportunity to break those silos, to start to improve communications, and start to improve the control and the orchestration of the work across multiple business units. But in doing that, you're going to be running right up against corporate culture. And as we all know, excuse me, anytime you look at changing culture, you have a real problem. It can be done. There are ways to do it. You certainly would need to have executive buy-in, and then buy-in, excuse me, I apologize for losing my voice here. In Chicago, where I live, it's allergy season, and I apparently am getting hit today by allergies. So I do apologize for my voice. Anyhow, you know, the way that it's addressed will be unique to each company and each operation, but you need that buy-in. Because if managers don't, you're going to find that they continuously try to make things fail and go back to the status quo, the way things were. One of the reasons that they're doing that is that performance is now being measured and measured in a different way. They're being not only measured as to what their individual group does, but how the overall, we'll say, process group that they're part of is performing, which is something they don't directly control. So it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And so in doing that, it'll take a cultural shift, which means a sales campaign and sponsorship from the C-level and other things, including, you know, HR sponsorship. So, but it can be done, but recognize that it's something that you're going to have to address. The ERP reference is in here because in the mid-90s, when companies are starting to go to you know, installing large ERP systems, they at least the drive to move from a straight traditional hierarchical organization to more of a process-centric or process-focused. And the, you know, the impact, the benefits, is you can really look at things in a very different light than you can, you know, strictly down in the weeds. And as I mentioned, you can deal with a completely different set of business problems. Things that, quite frankly, have often not been adequately addressed. You can now figure out why they're happening, where they're happening, and how you can get rid of them. The final one is important on this slide. That deals with IT support. IT is traditionally divided and focused within not only an individual business unit, but within a certain set of tasks within that business unit. And so what you have are all these little point solutions that have been built in kind of a vacuum. Now that you take a process view, you can start to look at how they all fit together. You can start to find overlaps, which gets to total cost of ownership. You can start to look at, if you have 3 or 4 systems that just are not adequate, maybe at that point, it's worth replacing them with one system that'll cover all those functions that is adequate. So you can now take a different view of your IT support as the bottom line, and you can start to justify things that when you're dealing with the individual system within a business unit that you can't deal with, that you can't justify. Now, because of the broader context, you can see how it can support more than it was supporting, how it can be added to other things, and how you can have a very different type of solution. Now, in doing that and in moving, what we see is that there's a very different set of management rules that need to be created. There is, first of all, of course, there's a process owner, and that's an executive responsibility typically. It has to be executive because it crosses organization lines. But it has responsibility for and accountability for the successful design, development, execution, and performance of the end-to-end process. In addition to that, you're going to have a need for process managers, which become more of, we'll say, a focused role within the different business units, process analysts, designers, architects, business analysts. And again, keep in mind that we're not dealing within individual business units. These people are looking at the overall process, how that process is working, where it's breaking, where the performance isn't up to par. And so you're now looking at potentially a group of people for every process that is associated or aligned to a process owner that looks at the health of the process itself, the evolution of that process, and the way that either IT or production support, different ways of manufacturing or whatever, might be able to, different ways of distribution, might be able to improve the performance of that process, might be able to improve customer satisfaction, might be able to look at an improved way you deal with the customer for market share. So it's a different perspective. And that's one of the reasons I think that the more of the hybrid model is attractive to a lot of people, not simply because of the organizational silos in the individual kingdoms, but also it just kind of makes sense to have this group for each of the processes, or a subset or group of processes, to take that different look, that different perspective. Now, the process owner himself or herself is really the chairman of the transformation efforts for that process or group of processes. And really what that means is that's the person that has the responsibility and the authority to control how that process is going to evolve. The implications of that are what's important. The implications then is if somebody isn't controlling the way the overall process evolves, then they have an awful lot of influence on how each of the business units that make up that perform the work of that process, how each of those business units evolves, how its IT support is given, what types of technology it's moving into, and the list goes on. So that type of influence becomes significant. Along with that, you now have people looking at different priorities. Within each business unit, they'll have things that they have to get done. They all do. That's just the way it is. But from a process perspective, when you're looking at projects that take in multiple business units, you now have to start to look at balancing the priorities of those multiple business units and negotiating with them to see what's going to be done when and how it's going to be supported. You also have the responsibility for looking at the performance and how that performance is going to be aligned to those different business units and how they're going to then be measured and governed. And ultimately, the process owner is, in some respects, the cheerleader, the coach, that really has to align the different business managers, business unit managers, to support the changes that he or she is recommending for that process. Now, when we talk about governance, governance is going to make or break your move to process. And the reason I say that, if your governance is overbearing, you're going to have a revolt amongst all of the individual business unit managers. So it can't be overbearing. On the other hand, if it's too weak, nobody's going to pay attention. So striking the balance between being overbearing and being too weak becomes something, although it's not easy, and it's going to be different with each company and each group of managers within that company. I like to think of it as being based on relationship building and the development of trust between that group that you're pulling together. I always recommend that all the business unit managers form a type of change committee, a governing body for the process, and that gives them some buy-in. It also gives them a say as to what's going on. But there has to be some way, whether it's consensus or whether it is, I don't like to say direct dictation, but there has to be some way that the process owner can make sure that everyone is in alignment and that the way people change on an individual basis doesn't hurt the overall way the process functions, because it's quite possible for an individual business unit manager to make a change that is justified, cost beneficial, and any way that you want to look at it, something that looks pretty good to that individual manager, that overall harms the integrity of the process. So the process owner, to some degree has to be a diplomat, but in other respects, has got to enforce what is good for the overall process, and that's where governance comes in. So the critical success factor here is executive backing with concern over span and control of change, with the end-to-end perspective crossing traditional boundaries, and helping make decisions on the resources, the right not only number of resources, but the right skill sets that go along with it. And of course that gets into compensation programs and other things. But it's that executive backing that's going to help overcome the resistance in however you want to move away from the traditional organizationally focused approach. One of the things that we find that's helpful in the governance is a separate BPM Center of Excellence. And that Center of Excellence is responsible for the creating, maintaining, getting approval of the rules, the standards, the policies, tools, methods, techniques, aligning all of the organization's strategy and goals to the process and the process activities within the different business units, resolving, and this gets to be a big problem, big deal, which is the resolution of operational conflicts. When you start asking different business unit managers to do things that are good for the process, but maybe not so good for them, you're going to have a conflict situation. They're not going to want to do that. That gets into the expenditure of money. It gets into the assignment of resources. It gets into timing issues and a lot of different things. So the governance, the control becomes extremely important, as does the putting in place a structure to escalate. So if there's disagreement, who's the higher authority? How do you kick that in? What do you need to do in order to justify that complaint? And then how does that get resolved? Of course, there's training that gets in there. Everybody has to understand the standards, the rules, the methods, all that type of thing as you start to move forward. And then if you're going to move to any type of a process-centric way of looking at the business, you're going to have to model that process. I would submit that the better modeling tool that you can use, the better off you're going to be. The models should show the processes. They should show the sub-processes. They should also show how those sub-processes tie into the different business units. Going beyond that, as necessary to do different things is certainly appropriate. But for this, at that process, sub-process, business unit layer, at those three, at that boundary, is where you really need to have an understanding of how the systems, first of all, what are the components of the process? How do they fit together? What's the flow? When do you have parallel flow? When do you have serial flow? Where are the problems? What do the problems affect? And all those types of questions need to be put into that tool so that you have a complete picture of the business. And frankly, you need a better tool than a basic tool. So the more you don't need a terribly sophisticated tool, but the better the tool you have, the better the models you'll have, and the better the information that you're going to have to support those models. Talked a little bit about this. Starting your BPM Center of Excellence. According to a paper from Savion that we reference in the Seebeck, they recommend a 9-step approach. First of all, it's attaining that sponsorship, defining those goals and success criteria. And I'd like to focus just for a second on defining success criteria. A lot of organizations don't do that. And so how do you know when you succeed? And how can you justify a claim of success or a claim of failure? So the success criteria becomes extremely important, and that success criteria at this level needs to tie directly into the strategic goals and objectives of the organization, of the company, so that you can then look at justifying what you want to do based on helping the company achieve those goals. You need to establish a BPM architecture. Here's the library that we were talking about. Establish change management practices, and these are the policies, the procedures, the methods that we had talked about. Process inventory. Know what the processes are. Know how they interact with one another. And then look at how you want to prioritize the projects that you're going to recommend at the process level, and look at how you then build the support that you're going to need in order to get those funded, in order to get those things supported by the individual business unit managers, and then start to execute the processes or the projects. Now, we've talked about a lot of different things, and it's a long chapter in the Seebeck, and in an hour I can barely touch on a lot of the things. I certainly can't go into detail. A summary of what we've been talking about is in order, and then I'll start taking questions. Companies are still structured around a functional hierarchy for the most part. The problem is that that does not allow for accountability at the end-to-end process. In fact, in a great many companies, they don't really understand what those processes are. Managers, senior managers admit that to me all the time. And as an organization becomes more complex, as it becomes more sophisticated, as it grows, as you take on other organizations through acquisition, merger, what you find is you now need to start to look at business from a higher level perspective, and that perspective is process, so that you understand how all the pieces really fit together to deliver the end product. And you also then have the ability, where you need to drill down specifically into what's going on to drive a segment of work within that process. And that's the only way you're really going to be able to look at problems, to look at innovation, to look at different things, and its impact then on the different work that's being performed. Today, though, when you start to talk about process and a process focus, within the industry itself, titles vary, and here I have to apologize because in the middle of the slide it says tiles instead of titles. But titles vary, roles vary, culture needs to be changed, and the overall way this fits together is something that's evolving as everybody learns more about it. You know, once it's more mature, once the majority of organizations have either a straight process organization or the hybrid type of organization we've been talking about, at that point people will have learned a lot, and essentially the world's going to be a lot different. Today we're learning, and as we learn, we share, and the whole way that we look at this evolves. So over the upcoming years, if you know, you're going to consider this, you need to stay engaged in this part of the discussion and start to look at what people are doing, what's proven to be what works, and what's proving not to work. So you need to be engaged. You need to look at this as a program that's starting but going to evolve. And as it takes shape, you're going to be able to then leverage what other people have learned, just like they'll leverage what you've learned, and to continue to move and flex and improve the way that you're looking at this and the way that you're doing it. And the last thing on here is that the governance is just the key to this whole thing. As I said, a heavy-handed approach will get you revolution, and we'll say, an approach where you're too easygoing will just get you chaos. Some of the key concepts: the enterprise fosters a process culture when the business processes are known, agreed upon, and communicated, and visible to all employees. It's important that we find that it's important that employees, as you're starting to do this, understand how what they're doing fits in, so they don't feel kind of out in the middle of the ocean and with not understanding what's going on around them. That the process owner is going to have to accept and be given the responsibility and accountability for the process, the design, the development, the execution of that. You need to set up distinct governing bodies that sets the standards and enforces those standards through an organization such as a BPM Center of Excellence. And that you understand that the potential for organization change will itself evolve as this becomes more mature as we go forward. That completes the discussion for today. Before I go to questions, first of all, this. As a columnist for PECS, I write papers constantly. My latest paper is Evolving to Optimization. If anybody would like a copy of that, just let me know. Either call me or send me a note. And I would also urge you guys to go out and take a look at some of the columns. I think you might find them interesting, not only that I've written, but that other people have written at PECS. Next month, on October 15th, we're going to look at Chapter 9, which is Enterprise Process Management. At this point, we'll start to look at questions, and I have quite a few of them here from Fokian. The first one here is, let's see, could I name any companies that are champions? Sloan Valve is one here in Chicago that is one of the more advanced companies and looking at moving to a process orientation, process focused. Tom Coleman is the head of that, and he's a member of the ABPMP Chicago chapter, so you can get hold of Tom through the chapter. The companies that change towards a truly process-driven organization report a higher performance. I'd like to just say yes, but I can't say no either. There's just not enough reporting that is generally available through like Forrester or Gartner to say that at this point, at least in my opinion. So I would say I'd like to think so, but that's something that I don't see in the literature as being widely reported and reported in a way that I think is not, we'll say, personally biased to the person who's writing the report. So we're just not sophisticated or haven't evolved to that point yet, Fokian. What types of business are more suitable to operate with a completely horizontal process? I think that's kind of tough. Manufacturing is where a lot of these things have started. Also, different pieces of insurance. I think I would say I've seen this mostly in manufacturing, but that's just to say that's mostly where I've looked. I could definitely see things moving in this direction. I know a couple of insurance companies that are headed in this direction. They're still fairly new, but they're headed in this direction. In my opinion, is there a difference between a process manager and a value stream manager? I look at value streams as being a piece of process, although it could certainly, being applied like at sub-processes, because they more directly tie into the customer. Process conceptually ties into the customer, but it isn't until you get down to the lower levels. So value stream from a more strategic standpoint, I would say yes, that's a responsibility of the process manager. And then when you get over to the actual activities and how those activities then form value streams and how that rolls up, that then becomes, I would say, more of the role of the individual business unit manager. But there's a matrix, and kind of rambling a little bit here, Fokian. It really becomes a matrix, and I would say that the process owner really needs to be responsible for that matrix. That's just an opinion. This sounds like classic Lean Six Sigma work. No, actually, do I recommend Lean Six Sigma first, followed by BPM, or the other way around? I look, and this is kind of heresy to a lot of people, but I look at process work as being, and for want of a better way of saying it, so forgive me for my terminology, I look at process as being a higher level look, and then you apply Six Sigma within the construct or confines of a process. Six Sigma is going to tell me where I am going wrong, what I need to focus on changing. It's not going to tell me how I need to change it, nor how that's going to ripple anyplace else. And that's why I say I look at Six Sigma within the construct. Now that obviously, you could say, well, if you look at it at the company level, then you can apply Six Sigma at the process level. And yes, you can. So it just depends on the level of abstraction that you're looking at. I don't like to put it that way because it sounds like a cop-out. It sounds like I'm just kind of not really giving an answer. But it really depends on the perspective most of the time, and what I do and the people that I deal with look at is at the process level and below. And at that level, I look at Six Sigma as something that helps me look at where I need to consider change within that process. So it's just related to what I personally tend to deal with. Let's see. In my opinion, is there a difference between a process manager, and I just looked at that one, and Six Sigma, I looked at that one. Okay. Are there any countries where companies are managed around process-driven organizations? That one, I just, I wish I had the knowledge to answer that one. That one I don't know. Not afraid to say I just don't know, and I'm not going to give you a line of garbage just trying to show that I do. I don't know on that one, Fokian. What are some of the key quantitative metrics that one can use to demonstrate value of transforming from a functional organization to a process organization? Yes, executives are always looking for quantifiable benefits. One of the things that I've seen is if you can benchmark, and see, and this becomes kind of a difficult thing, because today you have an apple and an orange. You have, and by that I mean when you start to look at everything from budgeting to cost roll-up, it really happens at the business unit level. The business units, of course, break it down finer, but you now have this at a business unit level. Now, the fact that a process is split up amongst multiple business units, you now have to put together a different construct, and that construct has to identify the pieces of those business units that contribute. Now, once you do that, you can look at the cost, and you can look at performance and that type of thing. And you can look at it in a different way than you can at the business unit level. When you do that, you can now start to look at the benefit related to change. So that the difficulty right now, Scott, is that companies aren't set up typically to measure improvement at the process level. I think that overall, you can look at chunks of it and construct it and look at what it's going to do to waste, what it's going to look at overall error rates and that type of thing. But it's something you're going to have to build a baseline that typically doesn't exist before you can even start to measure it. Okay. Sebastian. What are the benefits of BPM and the main challenge of the organization to engage in? The main benefits of BPM is, first of all, it's a different way of looking at your business. It's a way of looking at your business that focuses not only on what you're doing, but how you're going to change that. So it aligns the current operation with change and how that change is going to be affected. If you do it right, it gives you a holistic view of the business operation. Even if you're not dealing with process, it gives you within a given business unit. It lets you look at everything that's happening within that, including how it's supported, who your collaborative partners are, how you interact with the customer, and a variety of other things. And you can take that down to any level of abstraction that you want, any detail. By doing that, you can now start to look at problems in a different way. You can start to look at performance in the workflow within the given organization unit. So it allows you to hierarchically take different looks at the organization and how they're going to change. If you get into BPMS supported BPM, it now lets you take those same models and first of all simulate the operation, so you can now start to embed performance management and understand what that's going to do, where you understand how you're really performing against standards and targets. With the BPMS, once you get that simulation the way you want it, you can now generate the application systems to better support the business operation. You'll be using your traditional systems as well as new systems that you generate. The BPMS gives you kind of we'll say an environment in a box, so that when you sign on to do something, a task, you're signing into the BPMS itself. It then executes and calls and does everything else it needs to tie into the legacy systems. So it gives you a type of flexibility, it gives you speed of change, and it lets you evolve anything that you need until it operates exactly the way you want it to do and gives you the results that you expect, whether it's from standards or whether it's from operational performance. I don't know if anybody's still with me. I'll keep going here for a little while. Fernando, is it true that single process owner is a permanent threat to director or senior managers? It could be viewed that way. That's why I say in the matrix organization, these managers will either have a dotted line reporting to the process owner, or it becomes difficult because at that point the process owner really doesn't have the ability to make people do anything. And this gets into the relationship building aspect and the collaboration aspect that I was talking about. But yes, in some organizations, depending on the people that are there and the way those people deal with others, yes, it definitely can be a threat. That's why you need to be careful as to who you're going to allow to be a process owner. People that just take a heavy-handed approach, people who don't interact with others well, don't build consensus well, are not the right people for that. They can be very knowledgeable, but if they don't have the people skills that are necessary, they're just not the right people for the job. Okay, trying to get down here to the next question. Oh, okay. From Omar, suggests some communication activities to engage process owners of a highly hard. Okay. Um, you know, Omar, I've found that the best way to start to engage different managers who may not want to be engaged, shall we say, is find out what their pain is. Find out what their problems are. And the process owner should then be able to leverage that information and say, here's how we can help you. Here's how we can help the company. Here's how everybody can become better off for us working together. That's really the only way that you can, that I've found personally, that you can start to get past those types of issues. It just becomes to everybody's advantage to work together if it's structured properly. And that's really the way that it has to be done. Again, it can be done by what we will call a thou shalt, which is senior management saying this is going to be the way it is. And that's the other way to do it. But I prefer the people approach. Fokian, thank you very much. Oh, thank you, Fokian. Sebastian, thanks. Okay, Edward, you're still there. I hope you're still here now. I see about 38 out of 54 people are. And that, I've now run through all of the questions. The presentation will be put on the ABPMP website, and you'll be able to get through there. I would encourage you all to, whether it's this one or some other topic that we're covering with the Seebeck, some other chapter, I would encourage you to tell your friends and your the people that you work with about this, and encourage them to go out and look at the different webinars that might be of interest. Thank you all, and